Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay, great. All right, everybody. Um, after a minute silence for the Queen and our panel here, I'd like to welcome everybody to this extraordinary event about the 1970 hijacking of the El Al Flight 219 with Heiko Triesch, Jon Dannemann, and Uri Bar-Lev. It's really a pleasure to have the three of you here from near and far. And thank you, really, thank you for joining and thank you for your time. Heiko, we're going to start with you. If you can give us some context about this story and introduce us to the what happened. And from there, we'll move on to Jon and then to Uri. With regards to questions from the audience, we will take questions at the end. Please post your questions in the chat and I will read them later on. Thank you very much. And the floor is yours, Heiko. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to that session. And
1, 2, 3.
And I have to thank especially Jon. We met last year, and we just talked recently that we had no idea how that will lead us to. But I'm very happy to be with you tonight, and I hope it will be a little bit interesting for you what I'm telling about, what I'm speaking about. Jon and me, we talked about a little overview about hijackings to get everybody a little introduction. And maybe if time is not running too quick, I can tell you, if you want to, a little bit the story of the aircraft before and after the hijacking. Hijacking was, or civil aviation really started after First World War, and the first hijacking that is known happened in 1931. It was not a real sensation, just some people asked a pilot to fly around to drop off some papers from the air, and that's it. And it took a while before hijacking was becoming something that is, let me say, common. And that first happened started in greater numbers from 1947 on, when people tried to leave East Europe. Many people tried to leave countries like Poland and Hungary and so on, and they asked the pilots or forced them to fly in the West. And there was a bigger number of hijackings, and at all, people were just people who did hijackings at that time were by the people more realized as heroes fighting for freedom, moving from the east to the west, and they had a very, very nice image. And they had there was no threat that they got penalties or something. And this was the first wave of hijackings that happened in the 1940s and late 40s. And after the revolution in Cuba, there was a second wave of hijackings. And also that was not very dangerous for the hijackers, because especially when they flew from Cuba to the United States, and later on, also a lot of people moved from the United States to Cuba. So there was something going on, but it was not as that what we have in mind with hijacking. That started in the mid and late 60s, that especially in the Middle East, the Palestinians tried to hijack a lot of aircraft in more and more numbers, and it raised up to, I think, more than 80 hijackings in 1969. So this was the highest number of hijackings at all. And from that time on, it became a threat for the civil aviation, and many countries started to to have new regulations and set penalties to that people. And it became a crime. And also the image of the hijackers changed from freedom heroes to terrorists. And so then some things were installed, like safety controls, controls for weapons, and all that stuff that we know today, that you have a lot of controls at the airports. And so the number went down on of hijackings, and it in the 80s you have maybe 20 a year. So this number was okay. And then after September 11, the safety requirements were even stronger, and up from that time, we have only a very, very low number on hijackings in the air traffic. So this is a little overview about these hijacking stories. And I can tell you also a little bit the history of the aircraft we are talking about. That was part of the attempt of hijacking in 1970, El Al Flight 219. So this aircraft was built at Boeing and had its rollout in 1961, and then it made its first flight with El Al in June of that year. And it was used by El Al until 1984, and then it was given to another aviation or airline company, also in Israel, and they used it from 84 to 86. And in 86, it was still under possession of El Al. El Al sold it back to Boeing. It became a new registration, and then it was at the Boeing field, and Boeing was thinking about what to do with it. And during that time, Lufthansa was becoming the 200th airplane delivered, and took it over. And as a little gift at the side, Boeing donated the 707 to Lufthansa. And Lufthansa asked, there were a little discussion at Lufthansa what to do with an aircraft, and they would like to get a 707 because they would like to fly to Berlin, because during that time, Lufthansa was not allowed to fly to West Berlin. So they would like to have something like an advertisement at the airport. And also they would like to say, we would like to fly to Berlin whenever it is possible. And so the aircraft flew in 1987 to Berlin. And in that year, also, there were a big celebration about the
Heiko, you've muted yourself. I'm sorry.
put my papers on the desk.
Oh, I see. We're at 1987 with Lufthansa.
Okay, so in 87, Lufthansa flew with, or an American crew flew the aircraft to Berlin with an American registration. And as the aircraft landed in Berlin, everybody could see that it was painted in Lufthansa markings and everything. So it was a kind of half illegal flight. But Lufthansa would like to have the aircraft in Berlin because they would like to have an advertisement in this city, and they donated it to the city for the 750th anniversary. What should happen with the aircraft afterwards, nobody thought about. And it was just standing in front of the terminal, and everybody who was moving to the terminal or leaving the terminal saw that aircraft. And it was a little sensation at the time, but after 1 or 2 years, it is just an aircraft sitting in front of an airport. And then as the wall came down, Lufthansa was able to fly to Berlin from 1990 on. And from that moment on, nobody had really an interest in the aircraft. And so it was standing just at the airport, and it was moved from the front of the airport behind the fence of the airport. And then it was just parked somewhere at the end of the runway, and a little bit it became a forgotten item. And we as a museum got the aircraft in just after it landed some half a year ago, because it was donated to the city of Berlin, but that would mean it would be a gift for the mayor. The mayor had no space for an aircraft, of course. So he gave it under our possession, but nobody asked us in advance. And we had a big problem just to put it somewhere, because it was not possible for us to move the aircraft from Tegel Airport to some location where we could put it on storage or something else. So it stayed at the airport and it got forgotten, and then the airport was closed 2 years ago, and we had to move 1 year ago, and we had to move the aircraft away from the airport, and that was something which was impossible, and finally it had to be scrapped. And that's a story I have to tell you about that aircraft and about hijackings.
Thank you very, very much, Heiko. Do you want to maybe just add about the scrapping, how you felt about it, what you thought, and
yeah, that's I didn't prepare anything about that, but I'm working in a museum, and I have to take care for a collection of something around 70 aircraft. And of course, I don't want to scrap aircraft. I would like to save them for forever in the best case. But in that case, it was absolutely impossible. And I felt very sad about it. On the other side, the aircraft was standing outside for more than 30 years. So to restore it or to do something with it would be very, very expensive. And we were not able to get funds for that. So the only thing we could do in the end was that we just saved a larger part of the vertical, yes, the vertical stabilizer. And this is for me, this is a very important part of the aircraft, because there we had the markings of LL on top of the stabilizer, and also this part is not too large to have it on display inside somewhere in the museum. So we just kept that one part, and that's it. We really tried to do something. We talked to the police, to the firefighters, if they have any chance to keep it or to move it. We talked to the embassy of Israel if they could support us. We asked in the city all around, all the political institutions, and it was impossible to keep it. Just at the last day, somebody showed up and told us, I would like to keep it. It was somebody who was responsible for the area of the airport, and he told me that it would be nice to have an aircraft at the airport, also if it is closed. But I think he had no idea what he was talking about, because to keep an aircraft of that size in a good condition is just very, very expensive. And so also this idea just disappeared in a way. And we had a date where the aircraft had to be put away from the airfield, and so we had no chance to keep it.
thank you for that. So if I understand correctly, one part of it was kept or none at all?
One part of it, it's maybe 6 square meters, 8 square meters.
So that is some kind of memory of it.
It is. It has a David star on the horizontal stabilizer. It's just the top 3 meters maybe of it. So It's a large part, but of course it is not the airport, the aircraft.
Right. Thank you, Heiko, for that really interesting account of the history of hijackings and what happened to this specific aircraft. That was really interesting. And I will now move on to Jon and give Jon the floor. Jon's parents were on the El Al plane, and he'll tell us more about what happened on that day.
Well, thank you very much, Chagit. Really appreciate it. I just want to start off that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak today, and to everyone who is giving service to this occasion. This was a very momentous event in my parents' lives, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So thanks to the Education Committee, thanks to obviously Uri and Heiko for being here today at this very late hour. I mean, it's 8:20 here, but it's even later in Berlin and in Israel right now. And Louise and Rabbi Zova and everyone who was involved, and of course, I appreciate greatly the interest that I've received in the run-up to this event. So, just briefly, I'll just say a few things about my parents, and then just go on to how they experienced the day. Something I really appreciate is that my parents really collected a lot of documents about their lives, with good reason, I think. And then I also say what the impact of that was on my upbringing as well. So I'll start with my father, because my father was quite a bit older than my mother. He was 25 years older. He was born in 1923 in Germany, and he left in 1935 with his father for Brazil. He spent 25 very formative years there altogether roughly, and he had a career as an orchestra musician on the violin and the viola. He lived in Germany, Italy, and the United States. And at the time of this hijacking, he was a violin teacher in the Midwest in the late 60s and early 1970s. As a violin teacher, he met my mother. My mother was born in 1949. She was 21 at the time. And she was a sociology major at the University of Missouri. She was a rising senior, which in American university jargon means that she had just finished her third year and was about to enter her fourth and final year. She studied violin under my father. I'm not quite sure whether it was a minor or as an extracurricular activity. Be that as it may, she became very interested in religious history, and I believe my parents, who were not married at the time yet, spent a summer in Israel. And my mother had something of a summer school course in biblical studies. And they were just returning from that on that fateful day in September 1970. So the flight, as far as I understand, I basically put together for tonight the recollections of my parents, together with the 3 or 4 newspaper clippings from that time. And so this was a Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, from Tel Aviv to New York City. There were about 148 passengers on that flight. This was not a direct flight. There was a refueling stop in Amsterdam. And while this refueling was taking place, the refueling was taking place at the far end of the runway with passengers having disembarked. And so officials were aware of other hijackings taking place at the time. They were quite common, as we just heard from Heiko. And there was a security guard who, when the re-embarking process took place, checked purses, or what we would call carry-on luggage nowadays. But security at that time was not very strict, and not all luggage was checked. And upon embarking the plane, my parents wanted to resume their seats. They had, according to the newspaper clippings that I have, they had 4th row seats together. And so there were 2 people who had taken their seats. And what my mother, in her recollections, in her cited recollections, mentioned that there was something off about these 2 people right away. Because everyone else had basically traveled from Tel Aviv, and they looked accordingly. They looked tired. They looked a bit disheveled, as my mother said. And here you had 2 very, very well-dressed passengers, both wearing sunglasses and looking quite well put together. So they both stood out, and they were both carrying boxes. Now, I think I remember my mother mentioning something that she may have consider them picnic baskets. But be that as it may, there were boxes. And my mother also said, was cited and quoted in the press as saying that these were maybe cookie boxes, cookie jars. However, it turned out later that they were carrying hand grenades in these boxes. My mother prompted them to move, but they did not respond. They were like brick walls, as she gave a quote to the journalists at the time, and she had to summon the stewardess, the flight attendant, as we would nowadays say, and she moved the flight attendant moved them to the third row seats, and so they apparently reluctantly moved, but they did. And it's quite interesting what the amount of historical detail that I managed to recollect, which I won't go through in its entirety now. However, apparently there was a lady called Mrs. Max Schenk on the plane as well, who was the president of Hadassah International at the time, and she sat right next to the kidnappers. And she had the Observer, and they had the London Times. So everything seemed like a very normal flight until about 1 hour into the flight, and I assume this will have been over British airspace or somewhere thereabouts. And the man, who turned out to be a Nicaraguan American Sandinista sympathist, got up, and he basically brandished a small silver pistol and began moving right into first class, after which shots were heard. Interestingly enough, he basically gave Leila Khaled, his co-conspirator, a sign by saying, "Yalla, let's get up, let's move." And there was an Arabic-speaking passenger sitting just behind them. So anyway, they moved into first class, and basically shots were fired. And my mother thought, like maybe some other passengers as well, that the pilot had been killed, because the plane began dropping sharply. And the coverage says that the plane dropped from about 30,000 feet to about 15,000 feet in a very, very sharp motion. So obviously that was a very scary event, and everybody started screaming. There was chaos, pandemonium on the flight. And so my mother also mentioned that people started praying as well, which I guess is a fairly normal and potentially quite healthy reaction, I'd say. But anyway, be that as it may, so the security, there was a security guard that stood up and tried to calm passengers. But my mother couldn't quite believe it, because he was so calm that she thought he might be one of the hijackers. So this is a very, very this is a very chaotic and confusing situation, and people are not quite sure what to believe. Certainly my mother wasn't. However, it turned out to be that this was one of the very progressive security features of El Al at the time. El Al, I think, was quite far ahead of other airlines at the time. And so what happened next was that this guard, somebody we might call a sky marshal nowadays, drew the curtain. He went into first class. He drew the curtain between first and tourist class and moved in when he saw an opportunity to stop the hijackers. At the same time, a stewardess tried calming passengers that everything was fine, and a second series of shots was heard. And the flight stopped diving shortly thereafter. So things, obviously my mother and my parents had quite vivid recollections, but actually things moved quite quickly in this very confusing situation. And only later did the passengers learn that in the first series of shots, a steward was wounded by the male hijackers. His name was Shlomo Bieder, as far as I know, and maybe Uri may have something to say about that as well. And basically, so first the steward was shot, and in the second series of shots, the male hijacker was shot. Now, after this had happened and the situation calmed down, the plane landed in London, where the flight was actually greeted by fire engines in case the hijackers may have hidden a bomb on the flight. That's at least what I gleaned from one of the newspaper reports. So there was an immediate evacuation, and that's actually when people realized that they had a modicum of safety. That's when the that's when the terror, the shock actually really started setting in. So an old man collapsed on a bench. There were terrified children. One of the children was in a wheelchair, and so there was just a general sense of being overwhelmed and powerless in the situation. And my parents very much had that sense while I was growing up, and I'll get to that in a moment, but there was a great sense of powerlessness in such a situation. So as it also turns out, an older man, a passenger, overwhelmed and pinned down Leila Khaled, who went on to be an icon of the Palestinian terrorist movement. And he had apparently advanced upon her with others. She had hidden 2 hand grenades in her bra. You know, excuse me, but that's the way it was. And one fell out while she was being overwhelmed, but it didn't explode. Now, I'm not quite sure about that. Somebody mentioned, my mother, I believe, mentioned me that she threw it. Again, happy to get input from other sources there as well. And yes, so after the evacuation, Patrick Arguello's body was removed after the passengers had been evacuated, while Leila Khaled was held on board. And my parents may have been interviewed by Scotland Yard, now known more commonly as the Metropolitan Police. And you know, all in all, the flight arrived at JFK 18 hours and 15 minutes after the hijacking had begun, at about 2:30 local time. And the New York Times reported at the time that they were greeted by about 300 people. Of course, many friends and relatives, many people directly connected to the victims on the flight. But there were also people who had heard about this event, and they spontaneously decided to help greet the flight. They held up painted signs saying Shalom, and they painted these signs very hurriedly before making off to JFK Airport. They sang Am Yisrael Chai, and actually, I have a picture here. I don't know how visible this is, but I'll try. This is a picture of people dancing the Hora upon arrival. They danced the Hora, so it was really a great sign of relief that, you know, this anti-Semitic attack ultimately had been overcome, and that people survived, because the other flights didn't go that well. You know, there were extended negotiations, if I remember correctly. And so what happened after that, my parents personally, they flew on to Peoria, Illinois, which is where my mother was from. That's basically southern Illinois. You know, it's pretty much as Midwestern as it gets. And that's where they were greeted by my grandparents, my mother's parents. And again, so they got, I mean, this hijacking got a feature in the Peoria Journal-Star. Okay, I see that I need to turn off my background or weaken it a little bit. I'm not sure whether I can do that now, but just to give you an idea, they basically got a whole title page in the Peoria Journal-Star. And there was also a picture of my mother being greeted by her parents. So yes, this was basically one of the most profound moments in my parents' lives, and it had a great impact on them. I mean, there's so many things. They didn't talk to me about it that much. I think there was still a great sense of shame, and that feeling of being overwhelmed and powerless, and, you know, having survived. You know, survivor's guilt is a common term in situations like this. So I think that's something that they felt. My parents certainly feared flying for the rest of their lives. Very wary. I remember as a teenager one flight to the bar mitzvah of a cousin. And shout out to my cousins, many of my cousins who are here today. Thank you very much for being here. My parents were very anxious to leave me in the care of others where transport was involved, so school trips, you know, especially where buses over long distance, you know, busing over long distances, over motorways was involved. And my parents understandably wanted to ensure that I was buckled up at all times, and, you know, that you know, that I was, you know, given due care, especially as an only child. You know, that's a very important factor to bear in mind. My parents had me, and they loved me very dearly, so they made sure I was looked after. Yes, I was always asked to buckle up, even when it was not the done thing. So, and I think one of the other things, just on a wider scale, not to give her too much of a mention today, but Leila Khaled went on the speakers. She was part of a prisoner exchange, as far as I remember, and basically she went on the speaker circuit. And actually, until quite recently, I mean, a year ago or two, she spoke, or she was at least invited to speak by students at San Francisco State University, and so she continues on. But yes, I mean, I'm very grateful that my parents survived. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And you know, by a small margin, you know, a hand grenade could have exploded. You know, something could have gone wrong. And it's really just down to the courage of Uri and others that, you know, that we're here today to tell this story. So thank you very much.
Jon, thank you very much. We are meant to move on to Uri now, who will tell us his fascinating story. This, by the way, is the only hijacking that was ever thwarted mid-air. There's none since, there were no others. But I think Uri, for some reason, is no longer on the Zoom. So, Jon, if you would be able to contact him, that would be great. Unless I'm wrong, Uri, are you here? Give us a shout out. And then whilst you contact him, in the chat, Tikva wrote that she was on the TWA flight hijacked on the same day. Tikva, would you kindly tell us your story while Jon contacts Uri? Just unmute and join us.
Yeah. Hi. Yes. We were on our way back. I was with my family on our way back from Israel to America. It was Sunday, September 6th, 1970. And we had to stop off in Frankfurt. And the security, supposedly, those metal detectors weren't working. And the two hijackers got on our plane. It was George Habash, who also became very famous, and someone else. And as the pilot was announcing we're flying over Brussels, the hijackers went to the front of the plane and said and announced that we're being hijacked. Everybody stay in their seats, put your hands behind your head, nothing will happen. And like, we couldn't believe it. And we're going to a friendly country. They're taking us to a friendly country. And then so everybody's saying, oh, we're going to Cuba. Everybody was, as Heiko said, everybody was going to Cuba, and everybody said, fine, we'll go to Cuba, and you know, we'll be on our way. Well, a few hours later, we ended up in Jordan, and we were there for a week. It was very traumatic. I was 11, and I was there with my 4 brothers and my mother. My father had left earlier, and he was coming on his way to Kennedy to pick us up, and he heard that the plane was being hijacked. We were in a desert on the landing strip, Zarqa, and the first night they took off. So back then they had to stamp passports. Israel, the plane was going around the country, around the world. So, and there were some people that were collecting stamps, because you would stop off in Israel and they'd get stamps on their passport. They were in Israel. So they collected all the passports. And as we landed in Jordan, there, the whole army, the PFLP, got on the plane, a whole bunch of people. They dug trenches around the plane, so we couldn't leave. They took all our passports away. Anyone that was in Israel had to stay on the plane. Those that weren't in Israel and weren't Jewish were taken off the plane, and they were taken to a hotel, which wasn't much better then. There was a civil war going on in Jordan, and the PLO. My brother actually wrote a book about this, because he was one of the ones that was taken off the plane. They took off every couple of nights. They took off more and more men from the airplane. And he was 16, and they took off people over 14 men off, because that was army age in PLO, PFLP. and they took them away. Nobody knew where they went. So he wrote his story, Terror in Black September. And we sat on the plane for a whole week in Jordan, in the desert, on the airplane. And finally we were released. We were taken to Jordan. There was a civil war going on there. It wasn't safe, but they took us to the hotel, so we had to go to a different hotel. And then finally Monday we left on Israel Sunday. Finally Monday we came back to America, and the planes, it was shortly after we landed, in the middle of the night, another plane landed, a Swissair, and then a few days later, Boeing. And there was no landing strip or anything. The Swissair almost crashed into us. And then they finally let everybody off, and there were a lot of negotiations going on to release terrorists, and then they blew up the planes, so we didn't have planes to save. They ended up blowing up the planes, but we were very lucky at that point. I think we were one of the first hijackings in PFLP that they were kind of afraid to do anything, and we really believe that that's why nothing happened. They told us the plane was wrapped in dynamite, and that if they didn't get the demands from the United States and from Israel, they were going to blow us all up. And yeah, so we lived in the desert for a week on an airplane with sandstorms, and it's 52 years later, and it's still very much fresh in my mind. And
Wow.
Every year we celebrate the Hebrew anniversary of our miraculous return. And
Tikva, what's
and
the
it's funny,
Hebrew date of it?
of our returning home was Yudalid Elul, which was just this past Shabbat. And it's funny, I was just about to text to my kids, because my kids, how it affected I fly a lot, but I look around, I check and see who's getting on the plane, and my kids, until they were in their 20s, were not allowed to fly anywhere alone, because there were kids on the plane without parents. And in fact, some of those, there were 3, I think, siblings on the airplane that their parents went on the El Al flight. They sent them on this other flight. I think they couldn't all get together, or somebody had to get there first or whatever. So they didn't find out until they landed that their kids were hijacked as well on the TWA flight, and they didn't come home for a while later.
Wow, I'll just give a bit of context. There were 4 planes hijacked that same time. And the PFLP, which is the Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was also afterwards merged with the PLO, that was the more known wing of it, demanded that all those planes fly to Jordan. The only one that didn't fly to Jordan, and Zarqa was a little bit outside of Amman, in the middle of the desert, just like you say. The only one that didn't fly to Jordan was the plane that John's parents were on. That one landed in Heathrow, because part of foiling the attack on that plane was what Uri did, which was a specific maneuver, which was dropping the plane drastically on a very sharp angle, which caused the terrorist Laila Khaled to fall. And once she fell, passengers tied her. And that was part of foiling that hijacking. But that was the only one that landed at Heathrow. They got permission to land in Heathrow. Also, they had somebody, one of the flight attendants was severely injured. He did make a full recovery. And she, in fact, was released as part of the other planes, the negotiations for all these hijackings. And she was released from London. She was taken by Scotland Yard, but released. There was a dispute between the British and the American officials on whether or not to release her, but she was released as part of the exchange for all the passengers who were eventually all released. John, any success in We can't seem to log on. I see John writes. Okay, John, what do we have?
Yeah, so we have Anastasia Torres-Gill on this call, and she's his biographer. Just got in touch today, so thanks for doing that, Anastasia. But I think she's trying to help him log on, if I remember that.
That's great.
Otherwise, she might be able to help us. You know,
Yeah, let's. Okay, so should we give it a minute? Is Anastasia on? I can't see Anastasia amongst our participants, but if she would give us the accounting of what happened on that day on that plane, that would be great. If we, oh, Anastasia, you're here. Okay, can you unmute yourself and
if you give me one moment, I can read from you a chapter of Uri's testimony about what happened. So I can pull that up for if you would like that.
Sure, we would very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, give me 1 minute and I will be right back with you.
Okay, great. In the meantime, if anyone has any questions for John or Tikva or Heiko, just put them in the chat. Tikva, do you remember them separating passengers that were Israeli or Jewish from the rest of the plane?
Yes, and luckily there were not very many Israelis on the plane. That's why we couldn't understand why there were so many negotiations between Israel and us, because I don't think there were any official Israelis on the plane. There was one woman who had a dual citizenship with Saudi. She was, I think, Saudi Arabian, but she was Jewish. And they gave her a very hard time because she was wearing a short skirt or something. And they yelled at her. And she says, well, I didn't know I was going to be, you know, because you're not allowed to wear shorts or a short skirt. And she said, well, I didn't know it was going to be hijacked, you know. So, so she was able to translate some things that were going on. And they definitely did separate people, the Jews. One night they took us off. They took us off the plane, and we're in the desert, and the dignitaries, the Arabic and PLO dignitaries would walk back and forth across the plane. And one day they let us off the plane, and they said that we were going to be released. And the Red Crescent came, and we got all into all these vans. And when the Red Crescent left, they told everybody to get out of the vans, and they circled us around with the machine guns and everything. And they had gone through all our luggage on the plane. They took away, anything that was bought in Israel. Then they went through all the luggage that all the things that are bought in Israel. And my mother had bought all kinds of things. They found my mother's Hadassah card. They were ready to shoot her. And she was very calm, very collected, said it's expired. It doesn't mean anything. And then they initially did separate the non-Jews. The non-Jews that did not stop off in Israel, that didn't have a stamp on their Israel, were separated almost immediately. They were taken off the plane immediately. And then those people, one guy got up and he says, I'm not Jewish, I'm German, I have nothing to do with these people, don't make me stay with them. It was, but they did. In the end, I think it was all Jewish people left and people that had an Israeli stamp on their plane, on their passports. Right. And there were dignitaries, there were couriers, government couriers on the plane. And as soon as they heard they were hijacked, they pulled out their papers, and they start ripping things out and flushing things down the toilet. And yeah, we were definitely there because we were Jewish.
Right. John, there's a question here for you. How did this affect you? It's a question from Cheryl Dannemann. How were you affected as far as flying?
To send it to me.
Well, basically, there wasn't much flying going on except for a bat mitzvah, for a simcha. When I don't know, 14, 15, there wasn't much flying to begin with. But I have to say, it turned out to be a blessing, because we took the car to France and I got to I got to see the chateaus and the culture of France. So no complaints there.
Okay, and there's another question. There's a question to Tikva. Why did they destroy the planes? What were your thoughts and fears at the time? And what did they feed you that week?
Good question. They blew up the planes to prove a point. They had left 13 people, some women and men, some I think were married, but single and men. They were the last people to leave the plane, and they watched the planes blow up, and then they took them to be with the other people that were taken off already. So my brother was with other people, and that's a whole different story because there was a war going on in Amman, and civil war, and they gave us food. They gave us pizza. There was cholera, I think, going on around the same time, so the water was very heavily chlorinated, and we were kosher, so we tried to stick to the kosher food. They gave us watermelon, and because it was so hot, we had just come back from Israel, my brother took the watermelon seeds and put salt on it and put it on the wings. So we had like garinim, and hard-boiled eggs, warm ginger ale once, I remember. Not much. They took us off the plane once or twice just to get some fresh air, but and then we all had lost a lot of weight on the plane. Wasn't much to eat, and it wasn't very good. But I remember the pizza. Probably ate a lot of pizza.
And do you have any idea why they destroy these planes? I think 3 out of the 4.
Probably to prove a point, and it can never be used again. And the desert, we went back 1996, I think. My brother wanted to go back for closure for him because he wanted to see where he was held. And that's another amazing story. But so we found the spot where our planes were held, and the desert there absorbs everything. So the planes were never taken away, just got absorbed into the ground.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting.
That was an amazing, amazing trip.
Right. Anastasia, are you ready? Okay, great. If we can hear Uri's accounting from you, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see. Oh my gosh. Okay. Here we go. Let me skip the historical part. All right. I was going to quickly change into a suit, but I'm in California, so please excuse me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. On September 5th, 1970, Uri flew a group of German pilgrims from Lod Airport in Israel to Frankfurt. And from there, he was supposed to fly the plane that was fueling in Amsterdam to New York City. While they were getting ready to fuel the plane and check the situation and do the normal safety checks, Uri was approached by one of the Air Marshal security guards named Avihu. And Avihu wanted to talk with him about a security problem related to the seats assigned to each of the security guards on the El Al planes. And this is just by way of background so you can understand Uri's thought process. Although Avihu was new and had not yet flown even 3 times as an air marshal, he realized a glaring error. Avihu made the point that if terrorists were going to go to the trouble of hijacking a plane, it was likely that the terrorists would have collected intel about the flight, the behavior of the crew, and especially where the air marshals on the plane sat. If the terrorists had likely taken the time to do this, they would have quickly realized that the security guards sat in the exact same seats, one in first class, one in economy, on every single El Al flight. We even referred to, or you even referred to the security guards assigned to first class seat by the nickname 2C, as in, there's a problem and 2C wants to speak with you. This was air transportation in the years before computers. By always having the seat 2C reserved for the security guard, the one person who was scheduling all of the El Al ticketing could be sure that there would always be a spot for the air marshal in first class, which at this time was only about 3 rows, and the seat could be saved for him to ensure that there is an available spot. In those days, it wasn't uncommon for the first class sections of the plane to be empty, with the exception of the security guard, who would be sitting in the assigned seat of 2C. Between first class and the rear economy section, a thin fabric curtain was drawn. Any terrorist hijacking the plane who was sitting in economy would merely need to draw back the curtain and take aim at the back of the security guard's head to shoot him from behind. The security guard would have no inkling of what was happening. Our armed air marshal would be a sitting duck. Uri agreed with Avihu that strategically it was a foolish mistake for the security guards to always be assigned to the same seat. And he said he would pass his words on to El Al security when they arrived in Israel. But Uri had no particular influence on the security at El Al. But Uri said that Avihu's words were etched in his memory. On September 6th, he arrived with his crew at the airport in Amsterdam, about an hour and a half before the scheduled departure time for the flight. The flight crew was always early to do the various flight-related tests. And while he was on the ground, sitting on the plane, doing the usual checks, a security guard who was in charge of security at the airport on behalf of the Israeli security agency approached him in the cockpit. He asked in a low voice to speak with Uri in private. He asked if they could talk outside of the cockpit and on the plane. There were still no passengers on the plane, and they could talk securely and discreetly. The security guard, okay, yeah, sorry. I'm going to have technical difficulties now. Boy, where'd it go? This is, Mercury must be in retrograde, as we say in California.
Don't worry, we're patient.
Okay, that's a good thing. I'm just mortified. Okay. So the security guard came and said, there's some suspicious passengers trying to board the plane. And Uri said, why are they suspicious? The guard's answer was that all 4 had tickets with their names on them waiting at the El Al counter in the airport. 2 of the 4 identified as Senegalese. They had diplomatic passports, but with consecutive numbers and the first class tickets that were waiting for them. The guard explained that that was a red flag, and they would question anybody that had tickets waiting for them at the counter. That was unusual. And so when the guard interviewed the Senegalese diplomats, they had no good reason as to who got them the tickets, why were they waiting for them. So he was a bit concerned. There were 2 economy class tickets waiting, one for a man who said he was from Honduras, and his seat was in the middle of the plane. The second female traveler looked European, and her seat was in the first row of economy class. None of them gave a plausible answer as to who bought them the plane tickets. Decisions regarding concerns of these are not the role of the captain, but of the security services in Israel. The person in charge of field security was new to the position, and Uri guessed that was the reason he was even contacting Uri. Uri said, well, go remove the 2 Senegalese diplomats from the flight because of their subsequent passport numbers. I don't like that. That's fishy. The security guard protested, saying, look, it's a lot of money for El Al to lose. What if they're going to New York, the UN? They can't get a next flight. That's bad PR for Israel, you know, etc. And Uri said, I don't care. I'm not flying them. As to the other 2, who turned out to be Arguello and Khaled, Uri said, just check them carefully. Do a complete, body check and let me know. The security guard came back sometime later and said, yes, they've been checked. Nothing was found. Apparently, they were not checked well, or they were not checked at all in retrospect. And Uri didn't have a reason to kick them off the plane, but he had a gut feeling that it wasn't right. And these were the two diplomats turned out to be the Palestinian terrorists that hijacked Sivia's flight she was on. And Uri, by the way, was later sued by TWA for kicking these two Senegalese passengers off and TWA picking them up. So he won that lawsuit. Anyway, Uri at that time asked Avihu, the air marshal, to come sit with him, be with him in the cockpit. I say sit with him, but there wasn't actually an extra seat in the cockpit. He said, stand by the door. I just don't like this. If there's trouble, because there had been a lot, as Heiko had said, there had been a lot of hijackings. And if there's trouble, I want you with me, and I'll tell you when to leave and protect the passengers. I don't want you a sitting duck. So Uri starts the plane, and they start taxiing. And when he said to the flight attendant, go ask 2C to come up and be in the cockpit. And the flight attendant did that, and she came back and told Uri he refused. He says he has orders from his superiors. He must sit in a predetermined place. Uri asked the flight attendant to go back to Avihu and again ask him to be in the cockpit. Again, the flight attendant returned, telling Uri that Avihu had refused. Finally, Uri asked the flight attendant to return to Avihu and to give him this message. I am the commander of this plane. I am giving you an order to get into the cockpit. When Avihu entered the cockpit, Uri explained the reason for his decision to put him in there. If God forbid there is an attempted hijacking, he explained, I don't want you to be exposed to terrorists. Avihu stood near the door. The two Senegalese were on the TWA plane. Uri taxied down the runway and took off to New York. The passengers were buckled into their seats and looking forward to a routine flight. Uri said they climbed to an altitude of about 31,000 feet. They crossed the English coast. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated. The passengers were still wearing their seatbelts. And then the always malfunctioning hijacking warning light came on and began to flicker and beep. Uri said everyone assumed false alarm as usual. It would be easily activated by somebody brushing into it on the outside. They tended just to not always pay attention to it because of the malfunctions. But when the flight engineer said false alarm as usual, Uri said, no, it's an attempted hijacking. Uri said he remembered the sentence that every pilot knows, that in an emergency, do not immediately react. Fear is a bad advisor. For example, if there is a fire in the plane's engine, don't immediately press the button to extinguish the fire, because there are a lot of buttons on that control panel and you might be pressing the wrong button. And he said that this has happened not infrequently, where people end up cutting out the one engine that's still working because they've panicked and they've hit the button for the wrong engine. So Uri said what he did, and I don't understand how he was able to do this. He said he turned everything off that made noise and hindered him from thinking, and only then to check what is wrong. Said he turned off the alarm, silence, he took a breath, then he heard a loud knocking and pounding on the door to the cockpit. And the chief steward said on the internal radio, we have a hijacking. One terrorist is standing with a gun and threatens that if you don't open the door, they will blow up the plane. Behind him stands a woman, Leila Khaled, it turned out, with 2 grenades in her hands. Uri said he knew he had to gain time to think. The thoughts that ran through his mind in those seconds were, am I God? Do I choose who will be killed, who lives, who dies? Will they start shooting the passengers one by one and the crew? At what number do I open the door? Should I open the door not knowing what will happen? The pounding on the door intensified, and he asked the flight engineer to look through the viewfinder and let him know what he saw. The flight attendant said he saw Jeanette, the young Armenian flight attendant, standing outside the door with a gun pressed into the side of her head. And there was a woman with 2 grenades in her hand standing behind her. From that moment on, Uri said he was neither afraid nor unafraid. He acted like a machine. He said the pounding on the door was very, very loud, and he heard Jeanette plead, you know, Uri, if you don't open the door, he'll shoot me. And you have to remember that the El Al had, you know, several airplanes, crew was like family. You were working with the same people all the time. This is someone he knows saying, if you don't open the door, they're going to shoot me. Uri realized that time was running out. The co-pilot told Uri, open the door. According to the international aviation laws, the captain is responsible for the passengers' lives and welfare, and we must not endanger them. Without thinking, Uri declared, we will not be hijacked. Uri says he didn't make this statement after careful consideration. He heard himself make this declaration. It was like a voice came out of his body from deep inside. This is what he felt. This is what he knew in his bones. He would not be hijacked. He would not let the plane be hijacked. He would not let the passengers be harmed. He said it was a binding statement from which he knew he could not back down, but he just didn't quite know at that time how he was going to do this. He said he didn't know what was happening on the plane. In the first, however, he found out in the first class cabin, a flight attendant named Shlomo that John mentioned tried to attack one of the terrorists empty-handed and was shot at point-blank range by the terrorist. He could hear the shots, and he told the co-pilot that he was taking the steering wheels from him. And Uri remembered lots of thoughts running through his head. Will they kill us all? Will they take us to Syria? What will happen to us? And he's seen in his mind the worst case scenario. He said he had a picture in his head of the terrorists starting to methodically murder passengers and crew one by one, so he'd be forced to open the cockpit door. And at that moment, he realized what he had to do. The first thing he needed to do was get the gun that was pressed into the side of Jeanette's head away so she would be safe. The only way to do that, he realized, was with the help of a negative G. So in an airplane, the negative G force is an acceleration vector downward, and this acceleration downward produces a weight force in the direction upwards. Simply put, putting the plane into a negative G would be like being in an elevator in a skyscraper when the cable's cut. So the plane would plummet down, and the passengers and hijackers and crew would be lifted out of their seats and sort of hit the ceiling. But Uri realized that he knew that the passengers were still buckled in. So he told the crew to brace themselves for the negative G. And remember, Avihu, there's no seat for him in the cockpit. Avihu is just hanging on to the door handle. And he turned to Avihu and told him, hold on tight to that door handle and to be ready to jump out as soon as I give the command. Or he said he was hoping that Muti, who was sitting in the sky marshal on the other end of the plane in economy, would be able to rush in and help Avihu. Uri forcibly shifted the steering wheel forward and to the side, putting the plane into the negative G for a steep, sharp dive. Before diving, he managed to inform the London control tower of the emergency, Mayday, Mayday, but the air traffic controllers didn't know what he was talking about. And Uri was shouting at them, clear the sky because I'm going to dive. He said that since they were so close to the airport, there were many planes in the area and he didn't want to dive right into them. Initially, they still didn't understand, and they said, wait and fly over to point A in a holding pattern. And Uri shouted at them, you don't understand, it's an attempted hijacking. There's a shooting on the plane. And everything, by the way, was recorded at Heathrow Airport. And I think the whole incident took less than 3 minutes, and Uri's got a transcription of the recording. So Uri did an exercise that no one has ever done in a Boeing 707 in a passenger plane. He performed a negative G in an airliner full of passengers as if it were a fighter jet. And to do this, you have to be a good and experienced pilot. And when Uri was an instructor in the advanced stage of the pilot course, he taught trainees how to perform this exercise. In aviation, it's called a split ace. And this was a combat technique used by World War I fighter pilots in their dogfights. And because Israel was a new and poor country and could only afford surplus planes, Uri had actually trained on these World War I dogfighting planes. And so he was used to maneuvering them. But the question was, could he maneuver a large Boeing 707 commercial airliner this way? Was it even possible? So when El Al had received the 707s, a number of pilots were sent to Seattle to learn how to fly this plane back in the day. And there, Uri was working with the flight instructor, and he finished early. The flight instructor from Boeing was a former fighter pilot who fought in the Korean War, and he loved the Boeing 707, and he kept bragging to Uri that it maneuvered like a fighter jet. So the Boeing trainer asked Uri, we have some extra time, you finished early. Do you want to do another exercise? What should we do? And so Uri, with a half smile, this is years before the hijacking, asked the trainer, do you think it's possible for this Boeing 707 that you say is like a fighter pilot, do you think it's possible to perform an aerobatic exercise on this plane? And the trainer said, yes, if you do not pass the limitations of this plane. And that was a big if, but that was all Uri had. So I think you've heard, I'll stop there. You've heard what happened. I see the comment, Uri's pilots are the best. They're amazing. Just quickly in a nutshell, Uri drops the plane, and that's how they were able to, you heard the end of the story, subdue the terrorists. Layla Khaled, this iconic freedom fighter, fainted and remained unconscious for the rest of the flight, basically. Uri lands in Heathrow, and it's really a stunning adventure how to get the air marshals safely out of the plane, because in the past, air marshals on El Al planes who have shot terrorists, and this is one case in Switzerland, I believe, where the pilot was shot dead and the air marshal shot dead the terrorist. The Swiss actually arrested the air marshal and tried him for manslaughter. And the air marshal was acquitted, but not until he had, gone through trial and spent months in jail. So Uri was, he's thinking as soon as he gets to the ground, as soon as they land, he's still worried. How do I get these air marshals off? So you have to read the book when it comes out. But he radios another El Al pilot whose voice he hears and says, quick, switch to the internal frequency. The El Al pilot says, what's up? He says, I'm going to be flying right past you. And as I slowly go past you, our air marshals are going to drop out of the bottom of my plane. You put down the hatch ladder, and they're going to run up into your plane. Uri calls the security guard and says, I need 2 tickets printed. Get them on the El Al plane that's taking off for Israel. So these guys jump out, climb up, grab their seats on the El Al plane. The security guard calmly walks on. The Israeli security guard hands the air marshals their 2 tickets, and they're able to safely fly off and fly back into Israel. So Uri then, relief, great, and pilots deplane, terrorists are removed, and British police detective and 2 officers come walking up the stairs, and they say, step aside. And Uri says, what are you talking about? This is my plane. And he pulls out a gun, the detective, and says, step aside, you're on British soil now. So Uri steps aside, is so frustrated he removes the epaulets, his flight wings from his shoulder, stuffs them in his pocket, walks off the plane, and runs into, one of the firefighters who was there just in case a bomb had gone off on the plane. And the firefighter said, "Hey, did you hear what's going on?" And Uri says, "No, what?" Because Uri's just wearing his, white shirt and slacks. And the firefighter says, "Plane was hijacked. Israeli El Al plane was hijacked." And Uri says, "Really? What happened?" He says, "They shot the captain." So Uri, that's the end of that chapter. But what ensues is a lot of criticism from El Al and Israel towards Uri because he disobeyed their order to return immediately to Israel. Instead, he landed in Heathrow and saved the life of the flight attendant, the flight steward, who was really gravely wounded. Oh, and great, Tikva, thank you for sending me your email.
Wow,
And please tell me I wasn't on mute that entire time.
No, that was really a gripping accounting. Thank you so much for that. But as you say, he made a decision to land in Heathrow so that the flight attendant, I think his name was Mr. Weeder, could be
Mr. Veer.
taken, could be taken to hospital, and he did make a full recovery, if I understand correctly. Otherwise, the 4.5-hour flight, he wouldn't have made it. So
Right,
he
Uri
really
said,
did save his life.
Yeah, Uri said, after the plane was stabilized, he went out to see what was happening with Mr. Veeder, who he said was just white like a sheet, and there was no blood around him at all. And a doctor had been summoned, is there a doctor on board? Is there a doctor on board? And El Al had ordered Uri to return to Israel, which is, as you said, the 4.5-hour flight. And Uri said, I looked at this guy and I don't think he's going to make it 4.5 hours. I need to get him to Heathrow. I need to land as soon as possible at the nearest airport, and he needs medical help. The doctor said, no, I think he can make it. Uri said the steward was white. There was no blood around him on the floor. So Uri was thinking he must be bleeding internally. He was shot at, point blank range. And he leans down and the flight attendant says, "Uri, what will happen to me?" in the very weakest voice. And Uri looks at this doctor and says, "What kind of medical doctor are you?" And the guy says, "I'm a dentist." So anyway, Uri's never afraid to do the right thing. So El Al Shabak be damned. But that's a whole nother story. So thank you.
Wow, thank you for that fascinating story. I don't see any questions in the chat. There are a lot of thank yous.
Thank you. I'll take a photo and send these to Uri. He'll be very...
Yes, please tell him what a hero. And we look forward to that book. And if anybody else has any questions, oh, there we go. Oh, no, another from Julian. What an incredible story.
Amazing.
And thank you, Anastasia, for joining. Jon?
And thank you, everyone. And thank you so much for your personal stories, too. I have a fear of flying, and I've never had a bad experience. So I just cannot imagine the terror. So thank you.
Yes, I can understand. Okay, somebody's asking how you get a copy of the recording. I think these recordings are on the YouTube channel of Ner Israel, of the shul, of the synagogue. So it'll take a few days, but they could be put there. The website of the shul is nerisrael.co.uk, and you can always email and ask for a recording, and you can get one with pleasure. Thank you, everybody. This was really a fascinating evening. Thank you, Heiko. Thank you, Jon. And thank you very, very much, Anastasia, for stepping in and giving us such a gripping accounting of what took the events that happened that evening. And have a good evening, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for studying in, Anastasia. It was perfect, very gripping.
Yes, absolutely. Have a good evening, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Bye.